He tore her dress in front of 200 people, not quickly, not accidentally, deliberately. He took the fabric of her simple black gown at the neckline with both hands, looked directly into her eyes, and pulled. The sound of ripping silk moved through the Whitmore Estate's grand ballroom the way a scream moves through a church. Sudden. Impossible to unhear. Wrong in a way that the body registers before the mind catches up. The torn fabric fell from Vivian's shoulders in pieces, landing on the floor around her heels like the petals of something destroyed. 200 people stopped breathing, and Marcus Ashford stood in the center of his own cruelty, holding the scissors he had carried in his jacket pocket all evening, waiting for Vivian to fall apart. She didn't. She stood perfectly still, her spine straight. Her hands at her sides, her grandmother's pearl earrings catching the light from the chandeliers above her. And her eyes. Her eyes were the thing that no one in that ballroom would be able to explain afterward when they tried to describe what they had seen. Not tears, not shock, not the wide, fractured look of a woman who has been broken in public. Something else entirely. A light, quiet and steady and terribly certain. The look of a woman watching a man walk directly into the thing she had been preparing for him for 3 years. Marcus felt it. He felt the wrongness of her stillness, of her eyes, of the absence of the collapse he had been expecting. And for just 1 second, one single unguarded second, something flickered across his face that was not confidence. He covered it quickly. He turned to address the room. "All this estate," he said, his voice smooth and carrying, "this history, this legacy, none of it would mean anything without vision. And the vision has never been hers." He gestured around the ballroom, at the crystal chandeliers, at the plasterwork ceiling, at the orchids on every table, and the fireplace against the far wall and the windows looking out over 47 acres of Oxfordshire in the October dark. "I built this. I made this foundation what it is. I turned this estate into something that matters." He looked at Vivienne, standing in the ruins of her dress, and smiled. She is exactly what she appears to be. A woman in a 40-pound gown who was lucky enough to inherit a postcode, nothing more. The narrator's voice settled over the room like a blade finding its mark. Marcus believed he had destroyed her. He believed the torn dress and the 200 witnesses and the smile on his mistress's face meant that he had finally, definitively won. What he did not know, what he could not have imagined, standing there in his bespoke suit with his practiced smile, was that the ground beneath his feet, every inch of the Whitmore estate, every floorboard, every acre, every room of the 32-room house he had just claimed as his own creation belonged to the woman he was trying to destroy. All of it, signed, protected, hers. And she had been waiting for exactly this moment to show him. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from: London, Chicago, Lagos, Toronto. We want to know, and stay close. Because what happens next in this ballroom is something that no one who witnessed it will ever forget. To understand what Vivienne did in that ballroom, you have to understand where she came from. Not the postcode Marcus had described with contempt, not the inheritance he had spent 3 years trying to take. The person. Vivian Whitmore was 32 years old, and she had lived in this house since she was 7. Before that, she had lived with her parents in a smaller house in the village, close enough to the estate that she could see the lights of the main house from her bedroom window on winter evenings. Her father had been quiet and kind, full of the same particular attentiveness to the world that Vivian would one day inherit from him. Her mother had been a teacher who read novels at the kitchen table after dinner and who had a laugh that filled every room she entered with something that felt like light. They had died on a Tuesday in March, on a road between the village and the estate, on a morning when the frost had not fully lifted and no one had thought to warn anyone. Vivian had been at school. She had been 7 years old, learning long division, and she had not known for 4 entire hours that her world had already ended and been remade into something different. Her grandfather had come to collect her himself. Edward Whitmore was 63 years old at the time, a man of very few words but very precise ones. On the drive from the school to the estate, he had said, "You are going to live with me now, Vivienne, and I am going to take very good care of you. And we are going to be all right." He had said it simply, without decoration, without performance, and something in the simplicity of it had reached through the shock of what he was telling her and held on. She had believed him. He had been right. Edward Whitmore spent the next 22 years taking very good care of his granddaughter. He read to her every evening from the library on the 2nd floor, working through 4,000 books with the patience of a man who understood there was no hurry because the books would always be there and the evenings would not. He taught her to ride in the stable yard on Agnes, a grey mare who was already 15 when Vivienne arrived and who seemed to understand with the particular intelligence of old horses that this small person needed something steady to hold on to. He took her to London for the theatre, to Oxford for the museums, to the village farmers' market on Saturday mornings, and at every stage of all of it he showed her, by example rather than instruction, what it meant to move through the world as someone who knew their own value and had never once confused it with their net worth. He also taught her something else, something that would matter more than anything. The most important skill in any room, he told her once, sitting in his armchair in the library with a book closed in his lap and the evening light coming through the windows, is the ability to see clearly without letting anyone know that you're seeing. Most people cannot do this. They telegraph everything. Their face shows you what they're thinking before they've decided to think it. He had looked at her steadily. "You have the capacity for stillness, Vivienne. Protect it. It will serve you better than any other thing I can give you." She had been 12 years old. She had not fully understood what he meant for another 20 years. But she had remembered. She had always remembered. She had met Marcus Ashford 14 months after her grandfather's death. She had not wanted to attend the charity auction. She had been hollowed by grief in a way she had not expected and could not quite describe. The particular grief of losing the person who has been the fixed point of your entire existence, so that when they go the compass spins, and you stand in rooms that should be familiar and feel nothing but the spinning. But her solicitor, Mr. Graves, had advised her to maintain her social presence, so she had put on a navy dress and her grandmother's pearls, and she had gone. Marcus had found her within 20 minutes. Later, when she understood what she was dealing with, she would calculate that he had almost certainly known exactly who she was before he crossed the room. That someone had pointed her out. That he was not the kind of man who crossed rooms without knowing where he was going. At the time, she had believed it was accidental. He had been charming. Not the heavy, performance-heavy charm she had encountered in other men, but something that felt more specific, more attuned to her, rather than to a general audience. He had made a joke about a mediocre watercolour that had sold for £40,000, and she had laughed, properly laughed, and something that had been very tight and very cold in her chest since her grandfather's death had loosened. Just slightly, just enough. She had given him her number. 3 months later he had proposed. She had said yes. She had said yes because she had been grieving and lonely, and because she had believed, genuinely believed, that the man who made her laugh in that auction room was the man she was agreeing to marry. She had been wrong. But she had not been wrong for as long as Marcus believed she had been. 6 months into the marriage, on a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus was at the office and the Kensington flat was very quiet, Vivienne found a document on the kitchen counter. It had not been hidden. That was what struck her most, looking back. It had been left casually with his other papers, the way a man leaves things when he has decided the person who lives with him is not paying sufficient attention to notice. It was a communication between Marcus and a foundation lawyer about the possibility of registering the Whitmore estate as a charitable asset. She read it, standing at the counter with her coat still on. Then she put it back exactly where she had found it. Then she picked up her phone and called Mr. Graves. "I need to come and see you," she said. "Soon." "Tomorrow morning?" Mr. Graves said, and his voice carried the quality of a man who was not entirely surprised by the call. "Yes," Vivienne said. "Tomorrow morning." She hung up. She looked at the counter for a long moment, and something settled in her. Not anger, not the hot reactive feeling she might have expected. Something quieter, something that felt very much like her grandfather's voice saying, "The most important skill in any room is the ability to see clearly without letting anyone know that you're seeing." She took off her coat. She started making dinner. When Marcus came home, she stood at the stove and asked about his day, and he told her about a client meeting, and they ate together, and she listened and smiled, and all the while the thing that had settled in her chest that afternoon was becoming more defined, more certain, more precisely shaped. She watched him across the dinner table. He did not notice. He never did. The next 18 months were the most careful of Vivienne's life. Every Thursday afternoon she worked with Mr. Graves in his office on Fleet Street, building the legal protection around the estate with the precision of people who understood it had to be perfect, because the person they were protecting it from was not careless. She worked with Constance Webb, the barrister Mr. Graves recommended, a woman of 51, silver-haired, with the particular professional stillness of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms where the stakes were high and the margin for error was zero. Constance reviewed every document Marcus had filed, every foundation communication, every email, and she built the counter case with the same unhurried thoroughness she brought to everything. And Vivienne came home to Marcus every evening and asked about his day. She watched him grow more comfortable. This was the thing she had not anticipated, but perhaps should have. The more patient she was, the more invisible she became to him. She had always been a fixture rather than a presence, a wife-shaped object that managed the domestic architecture of his life while he managed the things he considered important. But as she became quieter, as she moved through their shared life with less and less that required his attention, he began to behave as though she was not actually there. He took calls from his mistress in the kitchen. He left the foundation paperwork on the counter. He invited her to events at the Whitmore estate, introduced her as a business associate, and watched Vivienne serve her tea without once considering what the expression on Vivienne's face might mean. He had made the fundamental error of a certain kind of man. He had confused her stillness with emptiness. He had looked at a woman who was watching everything and seen nothing. 14 months in, he filed the foundation's application to register the estate as a charitable asset. Constance Webb had the counter-filing ready within 48 hours. The court voided the application 3 weeks later. Marcus received the notification. He did not tell Vivienne, but she had known what was coming next, because she knew him, because she had been watching, because she understood that a man like Marcus, when he loses the thing he planned for quietly, does not accept the loss quietly. He makes it public, he makes it loud. He needs the room to see him win, because the room's belief in his winning is more important to him than the winning itself. She had planned accordingly. She had planned the seating, the exhibit, the documents hidden behind the photograph, Constance's position near the wall. Eleanor Fitch, her grandfather's oldest friend, placed at table 7 with a clear view of the entire room. The foundation trustees she had spoken to privately in the 2 weeks before the event, given enough information to know what questions to ask. She had planned everything, except the dress. She had not known he would tear the dress. But when he did, when she felt the fabric give way and heard the sound and felt the torn pieces fall around her. She understood that it was better this way, that a torn dress in front of 200 witnesses in a house that belonged to her, on land that had always been hers, was the most complete possible illustration of exactly who Marcus Ashford was. She stood very still. She let him finish. She let him say everything he wanted to say. And then she reached for the photograph. The photograph came away from the wall cleanly. Vivienne turned it over in her hands and pressed her thumb against the backing of the frame, exactly where she had placed the documents 2 days ago, and the backing released with a quiet, precise snap. The documents slid into her hands. She held them up. Marcus stared at them. His expression began to change. "These," Vivienne said to the room, and her voice was very quiet. The kind of quiet that 200 people lean forward to catch. The kind of quiet that carries further than a shout. "Are the title deeds to the Whitmore estate?" She turned slowly to face the full room as she spoke. "All 47 acres. The house, the library, the walled garden, the stables, every room, every inch of ground." She paused. "Mine, registered in my sole name, this past Tuesday morning, with the estate protected in perpetuity under a trust that carries no claim from any marriage, any foundation, or any person whose name is not Whitmore." She looked at Marcus. "The ground you are standing on right now, Marcus, is mine." The room absorbed this. It took a moment. 200 minds processing the same information simultaneously, recalibrating everything they had understood about this evening, this foundation, this marriage, this man. The Ashford Family Charitable Foundation's application to register this estate as a foundation asset, Vivienne continued, was voided by court order 14 days ago. Marcus was formally notified 3 days ago. She looked at him steadily. He chose to come here tonight anyway. He chose to stand in this house, in this ballroom, and tell all of you about his vision for this estate. His estate? She looked at the torn fabric on the floor around her feet. "And then he tore my dress, in my house, on my land, in front of my guests." The silence that followed was absolute. And then Celeste's phone slipped from her hands. It hit the marble floor of the Whitmore Estate ballroom with a sharp crack that everyone heard. She bent to pick it up with hands that were not entirely steady, and when she straightened, her expression had changed completely. The composed, victorious tilt was gone. What replaced it was something much smaller and much less certain. The expression of a woman rapidly calculating what proximity to a disaster means for her own position, and finding the answer deeply uncomfortable. She took one step back from Marcus, then another. Marcus did not notice. He was still staring at the documents. "Those are—" he started. "Certified," Constance Webb said, stepping forward from the wall. "Court-sealed, uncontestable." She opened her portfolio and carried a second set of documents to the nearest table, laying them out with careful precision. "I have copies for anyone who would like to review them." James Hartley, the pharmaceutical heir who had donated £230,000 to this foundation, was already out of his seat. He crossed to the table. He read, he turned pages, he read for 90 seconds, and then he set the papers down and looked at Marcus Ashford with an expression that lived in the specific territory between disgust and contempt, where very serious men go when they understand they have been systematically deceived. "My firm," James Hartley said, in the careful voice of a man controlling precisely how much of what he is feeling he allows into his words, "has donated £230,000 to this foundation under your stewardship in 3 years. He looked at Marcus. "I would like a full accounting of where that money has been directed." "As would I," said a woman at table 2. "And I," said the man beside her. Voices coming from around the room now, not angry, not chaotic, measured. The voices of people who have a great deal of money and have learned that the controlled expression of concern is far more effective than fury. and then Eleanor Fitch rose from table 7. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood, with the unhurried authority of a woman of 71 who has earned the right to say exactly what she thinks in any room she chooses to occupy. She walked to the center of the room. She stood beside Vivienne. She looked at Marcus. "I was on this foundation's board before you arrived," she said. "I raised concerns about the direction of the estate's relationship with the foundation. I was told I was being overly cautious." She paused. "I was not being overly cautious." She turned to address the room. "The Whitmore estate has stood for 280 years. It has survived things considerably more significant than this evening." She glanced briefly at the torn dress on the floor. "The question before us now is how the foundation proceeds. I suggest we begin that conversation immediately, in the dining room." She looked at Marcus. Without Marcus. No one disagreed. People began to stand, and Marcus found himself in the extraordinary position of watching 200 people turn away from him simultaneously, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the decisive, coordinated movement of people who have made a collective judgment and see no reason to delay acting on it. He looked for Celeste. She was not where she had been standing. He scanned the room. She was near the door. Her evening bag was over her shoulder, her coat was in her hands, and she was moving toward the exit with the focused, purposeful walk of someone who has decided that the fastest route to not being associated with something is to be physically absent from it as quickly as possible. "Celeste," Marcus said. She glanced back, just once. The expression on her face was not love, not loyalty, not any of the things that might have complicated the calculation she had just made. It was the expression of a woman who had believed she was standing beside a man with power, and has just understood that the power was borrowed and the bill has come due. She walked out. The door closed, and Marcus stood in the center of the Whitmore Estate's grand ballroom, surrounded by the torn pieces of his wife's dress, in a house that was not his, on land that had never been his, in a room that was already emptying around him. He looked at Vivienne. She was speaking to Eleanor Fitch. She was not looking at him. He took one step toward her. Constance Webb positioned herself between them without appearing to do so deliberately, the way a very good barrister positions herself, as though she simply happened to be standing there. "Mr. Ashford," she said pleasantly, "I think your evening here is finished." He looked at the room, at the backs of people moving away from him, at James Hartley carrying the documents to the dining room, at the string quartet packing their instruments, at the caterers clearing tables with their eyes down, at the orchids on the empty tables, at the photograph on the floor, its backing removed, the hiding place that had waited for exactly this moment. He looked at the estate around him, at the chandeliers Vivienne had grown up under, at the fireplace her grandfather had described to visitors, at the plasterwork ceiling that had been here since 1743, at the ground beneath his feet, all of it hers, all of it always hers. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned back one last time. And this was the moment that several guests later would describe as the most striking of the entire evening. Not the tearing of the dress, not the documents, not Eleanor Fitch's words or Celeste's departure, but this. Marcus Ashford, standing in the doorway of the Whitmore Estate's grand ballroom, looking back at a room that had already moved on, at a woman who was not looking at him, in a house where he had never, in any way that mattered, belonged. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He left. The dining room conversation lasted 3 hours. Vivienne sat at the head of the table, in the chair that had been her grandfather's, and she listened, and she spoke when she needed to, and she answered every question with the same clear, documented precision that Constance had brought to every stage of what they had built together. By midnight, the foundation had a new acting chair, Eleanor Fitch. By 1 in the morning, James Hartley had pledged to maintain his full donation under the new structure and had encouraged 3 others to do the same. By 2 in the morning, the last guests had gone, and the estate was quiet. Vivian sat alone in the library on the 2nd floor, in her grandfather's armchair, still in her slip, because the dress was beyond saving. With a cup of tea that Mrs. Pemberton had made before retiring for the night, 4,000 books around her, the house settling in the dark. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about Agnes in the stable yard. She thought about a Tuesday morning in October sitting across from Mr. de Graves as he laid documents on a conference table, and the autumn sun came through the windows and made everything look amber and final and exactly right. She thought about standing in a ballroom in a torn dress with 200 witnesses and her grandmother's pearl earrings and the complete, absolute certainty of a woman who had been preparing for exactly this for a very long time. She finished her tea. She set the cup down on the side table beside the armchair. The side table that had lived beside that armchair for as long as she could remember. The side table with the ring mark from 40 years of her grandfather's cups. She sat for another few minutes, in the quiet. Then she went to bed. What happened to Marcus Ashford in the weeks that followed happened with a kind of swift, unglamorous completeness that is characteristic of consequences that have been a very long time coming. The foundation audit was commissioned within a week. It took 8 weeks. Its findings confirmed everything Vivian and Constance had documented and revealed several additional irregularities they had not yet discovered. The total value of improperly directed funds was substantial enough to require referral to the Charity Commission. The news of the gala reached London's financial community the way all significant scandals travel in tight professional networks. Quickly, completely, with very few embellishments necessary. 3 of Ashford Capital's most significant institutional clients terminated their management agreements within the first 2 weeks. 2 more followed by the end of the month. The managing partners called, but they did not shout, they did not threaten, they simply exercised their right to leave, which they did with the quiet efficiency of people who protect their institutions' reputations as seriously as their institutions' money. By November, the Mayfair office was operating at a fraction of its previous capacity. By December, Marcus had retained a criminal defense solicitor. By January, Ashford Capital Partners had been dissolved. He sold the Bentley. He left the Kensington flat when the lease expired in February. He left London in March. No one who had been in the Whitmore Estates ballroom that October evening was surprised by any of it. Several of them, if they were being honest, were surprised only that it had taken so long. Celeste's exit was faster and quieter. She resigned from her firm within 2 weeks of the gala. She had been, in the end, a person who wanted a specific outcome and had allied herself with the person she believed most likely to deliver it. When that person's ability to deliver anything became definitively, publicly, irrevocably clear, she did what such people do. She moved on. She sent no message to Vivienne. Vivienne sent none to her. There was nothing to say. On a Thursday morning in April, 6 months after the gala, Vivienne drove to the Whitmore estate, not to a meeting, not to sign anything, not to speak to anyone. She went because it was April, and the walled garden was beginning its return, and she wanted to see it. She parked in the stable yard. She walked through the side gate. The garden smelled of earth and new growth, that cold green scent that belongs to April mornings and to no other time of year. The light was the clear, it-washed light of a spring morning after rain, and it made every colour very precise, very present, very real. She walked slowly between the beds. She stopped at the corner where her grandmother's oldest roses grew. They were coming back. Slowly, in the way that things that have survived many winters come back. But they were coming. She stood there for a long time. She thought about standing in a ballroom in a torn dress 6 months ago. She thought about the sound the fabric had made and the specific quality of 200 people's silence and the weight of the documents in her hands. She thought about how small all of it seemed now. Not unimportant, not forgotten, but small. The way things become small when they have finally been resolved. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from Eleanor Fitch. Foundation's first grant cycle under the new structure. 32 applications received. Would Vivian like to join the review panel? She typed back, "Yes, send them over." She put her phone away. She stood in the walled garden for a little while longer. Then she went inside. She filled the kettle. She stood at the kitchen window while it boiled, and she watched the light moving across the 47 acres, across the garden, and the stable yard and the grounds that rolled away to the boundary walls her great-great-grandfather had built in 1791. She poured the tea. She sat at the kitchen table. And Vivian Whitmore was exactly where she was supposed to be, in her house, on her land, at her table, content, not because she had won, but because she had never, at any point in the 3 years that Marcus had spent trying to take everything from her, allowed anyone to take the one thing that mattered most, the knowledge of who she was and what she was worth. Marcus had torn her dress in front of 200 people. He had stood on her land and in her house and told a room full of her guests that she was nothing. He had done all of that without understanding the one thing that made every piece of it fall apart the moment she chose to let it. The ground he was standing on was hers. It had always been hers. And Vivian Whitmore had simply waited for him to stand still long enough on it to prove it. Some people come into your life believing they can take what belongs to you if they are patient enough and careful enough and confident enough that you won't notice. They are always wrong about one thing. They always underestimate the woman who is watching. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories about women who never broke when the world expected them to, you know where to find us.